The Metropol Hotel is located near the Bolshoi Theatre in downtown Moscow. When it opened in 1901, it was a symbol of Russia's growing prosperity. After the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, it was often used by Lenin to give speeches at so-called party congresses. During World War II, the Metropol became a home and office for almost all foreign journalists allowed to work in the U.S.S.R. British journalist Alan Philps has written a book about those days called The Red Hotel. Alan Philps, today if you checked into the Metropol Hotel in Moscow, you could get a room for $244 or about 190 pounds, and it looks from the website that it's pretty attractive. What am I missing?
You are missing more than 100 years of history, when the hotel had been at the center of Russian history in the Tsarist era, in the communist era, and afterwards. It's not the most expensive hotel in Moscow, but it has got more cachet for those who understand Russian history for all sorts of reasons. And of course, what intrigues me is what was happening there during the Second World War, or what the Russians like to call the Great Patriotic War, when it turned into a press center for British and American journalists who Stalin didn't want there, but Churchill had insisted. So he said, fine, put them up in the Metropole, give them all the vodka and caviar they need, and a choice of young women to hire as interpreters and couriers, and keep them happy, but don't let them anywhere near the front line.
How many years have you personally spent in Russia?
Oh, quite a lot. I started in 1979 as the Reuters trainee for a year. I came back in 1985, but I was expelled for doing what they called activities incompatible with my status, as part of after Margaret Thatcher cleared out all the Soviet spies in London. Of course, I wasn't doing anything incompatible, but they needed some bodies to get rid of. So I was banned from the Soviet Union for a while, but when miraculously it became Russia, I was allowed back, and I was there in the 90s, 94 to 98. And I've been quite regularly, well, up until a recent time, quite regularly to do some reporting, or because my wife founded a charity, and she was attending some charity balls. Not that I like putting on a bow tie, but sometimes you have to.
When was the last time you were in Russia?
The last time I was in Russia was 2018.
The reason I ask is, and you allude to it in your book near the end, what's the comparison between Putin Russia today and Stalin Russia back there in the early 40s?
Well, in some ways, they are unrecognizable, because Russia was a poor country when Stalin was under control. It was a complete dictatorship. When Putin took over with the turn of the millennium, he he stabilized the country. He stopped the oligarchs ripping everyone off, stealing everything that was worth stealing and taking it abroad. And he was quite progressive in some ways. And Russia had probably the biggest expansion in the economy, the biggest consumer spending boom in its history. That was because the oil price was going up. That's the beginning and end of the Russian economy. There was a very free media, pretty free TV, and it seemed like Russia was becoming more European. Things began to get a bit darker in the second decade of this century, and Putin clearly was looking at his legacy, what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was to follow in the steps of those leaders of Russia who have the name Great after them. That's Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. They all expanded the territory of the empire. Peter the Great towards the north, getting some of the shoreline of the Baltic Sea. Catherine the Great getting some of the Black Sea in the south. And Putin became obsessed with the idea of stopping Ukraine from drifting away and becoming what he saw as a hostile forward position of NATO, which I think is ridiculous. But anyway, that's the way he saw it. So he gradually took control of all the written and broadcast media. There were only one or two outlets just for show, and his elections became just a parade, a charade, and all that led to, in 2014, the taking over of Crimea, which he noticed the West accepted and swallowed, and indeed business as usual continued. And he thought, I can do some more here. So eventually, as we saw in 2020, he set about a job which he thought would be very easy, which was to decapitate the leadership of Ukraine and bring it back into the Russian orbit. Of course, he miscalculated grotesquely.
The famine, and you write about that, the Stalin famine back in the early 1930s, and how does that track on the Ukraine story? Because how many people did Stalin kill in Ukraine?
Millions. Probably could be up to 6 million in Ukraine. The principle of it was that Stalin had decided that he was going to take control of the countryside. The peasants had nothing to expect from the Bolsheviks. They were a worker-based party, and he decided to turn all the peasants into basically state employees. They were working for the state, and whatever they produced had to go to the state, and he could decide what to do with it. To achieve that, he had to get rid of the people that in England we would call yeoman farmers, the successful farmers, those who had, due to their labor, had acquired more land and were making a profit. He called these people kulaks, which means a rich peasant, and he deported hundreds of thousands of them from Ukraine. The situation was most acute in Ukraine because it has the best agricultural land, therefore the most successful farmers, and it was a grain store for the Russian Empire. Not so much in the Soviet Union, because agriculture was just always in chaos, always on the point of collapse. So basically, he declared war on the Ukrainian countryside, on the peasants. He forced the Ukrainian Communist Party, or we should call it the Ukrainian section of the Soviet Communist Party, to implement this, to basically go into the countryside and steal whatever grain there was and take it away, even to take the supper cooking on the stoves in the peasant huts. This was excised from Soviet history, but of course the Ukrainians never forgot and never will forget. So it is one of the drivers of Ukrainian nationalism, and it is felt keenly by every Ukrainian.
What triggered your interest in Stalin and the 1941 Metropol Hotel?
That is a long story. This book had a very extensive gestation. I'd been to Russia as the Reuters trainee in '79, and a few years after that, Reuters sent me to be a correspondent in Tunis in North Africa. Not a great center of news at the time, or indeed any time, but that's where I was. There wasn't all that much to do, so I used to enjoy some lunches on the seaside, on the Mediterranean Sea, with a woman called Tanya Matthews. She was Russian born. She'd been Tanya Svitlova, and she described to me how she'd managed to get a job in the Metropol, interpreting for American, British, and Australian journalists. And in the course of that, she married a British journalist, which allowed her the opportunity to escape Russia. She'd always wanted to escape Russia because she had what was known at the time as a spoilt biography. That meant her origins were bourgeois. She could not have any type of further education. She wanted to go on the stage and she wanted to go to drama school, but they said, unless you were a worker or a peasant, you couldn't do it. So she thought, well, there's nothing for me here. And she moved heaven and earth to get out of the country, which she did. So she described the strange situation in the Metropol in wartime, a unique situation where fraternization, which was actually against the law and severely punished due to Stalin's paranoia, fraternization between Soviet citizens and Westerners was not allowed. But inside the walls of the Metropol, it was tolerated, even encouraged by the security services at the time. She was part of that. So you had this little island of freedom just inside the walls of the Metropol. Um, she she married Matthews, and she told me about the difficulty of of finding a wedding dress, of buying anything actually in wartime. And she managed to get to leave the country with her baby, even though very few people managed that. She was a woman who it was unwise to say no to. Anyway, and I thought, this is really interesting. I haven't read about this. And one thing led to another. I went back to Russia a couple of times. I got to know the Metropole better. But I was always looking for another side of the story, which didn't happen until 2017, actually, when someone who knew I was interested in the Metropole found a history of the hotel, newly published in Russian. And I turned to the chapter about the wartime, and there was names and dates and a lot of stuff which could be followed up, which I started to do.
Describe the hotel, either back then or now, but just give us an idea where it is in the city, what it looks like, how big is it? Who owned it, by the way, back in 1941?
Oh, well, everything was owned by the state. That wasn't the issue. It was built in 1905, and these days it is in the best possible position for any tourist because it is in the center of the sort of magic triangle of Russian power. On one side, you've got the Kremlin. On the other is the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the security police in communist times known as the KGB, the headquarters of the security police then and indeed now. And directly in front of it, you have the Bolshoi Ballet, which is the sort of symbol of Russian culture, as the supreme example of Russian culture, and much used as a source of soft power for Russia all over the world. So it has this wonderful position. It was built in 1905, and of course at that time Moscow wasn't the capital. Peter the Great had moved it to Petrograd, St. Petersburg in his time on the Baltic Sea to show he wanted to be more European. But even though there was no political power in Russia, it was where the rich merchants, the rich businessmen, the sugar barons, the wheat barons made their money. They were very progressive in their political views, produced great collections of impressionist art, which they bought all over Europe, which you can see in various museums in Moscow at the moment. So the Metropole was their plaything. You could see the wealthy people taking out ballerinas from the Bolshoi, either in the middle of the dining room, a huge space with a great glass dome, which has survived two wars without a scratch, um, um, and gypsy violinists, you name it. Um, uh, that, of course, didn't last beyond the revolution. Yeah, after Lenin took power, he moved the capital back to Moscow, but there were no offices for the government, and there was nowhere for the bureaucrats and the politicians to live. So they commandeered the hotel. It was called the Second House of Soviets, and it was full of Bolsheviks. Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky all gave speeches there. They lived on top of each other until accommodation could be found, and until people were shoved out of the apartment blocks and they could move in. Um, and that continued for a while until the 30s, when um, situation became a bit more normal, and the hotel was used as a place to invite foreign visitors, the people who Lenin called the useful idiots, those who could be persuaded that the Soviet Union was the future of the world. And these people were many, and they wanted to be convinced because after the great Wall Street crash of 1929, huge unemployment all over the West, there were churchmen, politicians, writers. They wanted to believe that there was an alternative, and they were put up in the Metropol, one of the few hotels which had ensuite bathrooms, and there was a whole panoply of guides and others who were told exactly what to tell them so that they had a good impression of the Soviet Union. For example, George Bernard Shaw, the Irish writer, playwright, winner of the Nobel Literature Prize, he celebrated his 70th birthday in the Metropol Hotel. He went to see a play, and at the end of it, the whole cast stood up on the stage and unfurled a banner in English saying, "Welcome to the great George Bernard Shaw." That was all part of the Metropol system. So when it came to wartime, the people who ran it were used to, should we say, manipulating visitors. That's why the press was put there.
At the time that you're writing about in the book, how many Australian, British, American, and others reporters were there?
Probably not more than 25 at the most. It was in London, the Soviet embassy was in charge of deciding who would have the right to go there, and it was up to the British government to provide them with transport. That was pretty difficult at the beginning. You could go on a ship to the Arctic and run the risk of being torpedoed and sinking to the bottom of the sea, or you could go sort of through Africa and up to Egypt and then Iran, which was extremely long. So about 25, a select few, and the journalists fought amongst themselves to have the right, but it was always the Russians who chose who they wanted to come on the basis of who would be most malleable or who was inclined to belief in communism and would write the most positive things.
Who were the reporters? I can remember one, Parker, I believe,
Yes.
New York Times and other places, who bought the communist or the Stalin line.
Yes, some of them came wanting to believe that Stalin was the future of the world, and indeed, they wore blinkers. They didn't want to see anything different. Others were the opposite. They saw this as a great excuse to come to Moscow. Firstly, they were going to they were going to report on the battles which would decide the end of the war in Europe. Indeed, that was the case. Stalin had different views. They never got anywhere near the front line. They didn't interview soldiers. Very rarely were they allowed to speak to a general from time to time. They were more or less corralled in the hotel and told to copy out what was written in Pravda and Izvestia, the official papers, which was propagandistic in the extreme. Um, so they were pretty unhappy bunnies, really. Um, uh, but you mentioned Parker. He came to Russia having dabbled a bit in with serving for British intelligence in the Balkans, not very successfully. Anyway, he was offered by the Times of London, the job of Moscow correspondent, which of course was a great privilege. By the time he arrived, he was in um, a, in a delicate emotional state because his wife had died in childbirth. Anyway, so he easily fell into the arms of his interpreter, who was called Valentina Scott. She had actually been married to an American student before, hence the name Scott, who was a true believer in the Kremlin line, and gradually, under her influence, he became the most trusted propagandist for the Kremlin, and indeed he stayed in Moscow all his life and died there in the 1960s.
When did he write for the New York Times?
He he wrote for the New York Times uh, from from the end of 1941. Cyrus Sulzberger had been there, obviously a scion of the family that uh, owned the newspaper. Um, he he spent a few months in Moscow, and he had a wedding, his own wedding, arranged in Beirut, and he left, and he appointed Parker in his stead. I would say that Parker didn't never seem to shine very much in the New York Times. They sent correspondence whenever they could to cover it, and he was the standby. Um, but he did do very well with the British Times, which was noted for its apologias for Stalinism and for believing that Stalin, whatever he wanted, he should be given in terms of controlling half of Europe. Uh, and he used to provide talking points for the assistant editor. Um, uh, um, uh, and the longer he stayed, the more he was caught up in the whole Kremlin lie machine. And when it came to the Korean War, he was one of the first reporters to report the well-known canard that the Americans were using chemical weapons, as indeed um, that's repeated to this day about the Americans in Ukraine, isn't it? Um, he reported on the show trials in Eastern Europe that some of the new satellite states put on to prove their credentials as good Stalinists. So he really he found himself deep inside the lie machine, but somehow he was never trusted. He worked for the Daily Worker after that, a communist newspaper, but they didn't think he was a real communist anyway. He was uh, he was a contradictory personality, and I think the spy and defector Guy Burgess, the British spy who defected in the early 1960s, he used to drink with Parker, but he said everyone knows he's an agent, but no one can say which side he's on. So a contradictory character.
Did any of the 25 journalists that were living in the Metropol ever get an interview with Stalin?
Depends what you mean by interview. They claim to have interviews. Um, every week they would post written questions in the Kremlin letterbox addressed to Comrade or Marshal Stalin, as he became later, with a few written questions. From time to time, very rarely, Stalin would issue some written answers. These were characterized, particularly in the journalist's memoirs, as an interview with Stalin, but Stalin never spoke directly to any foreign journalist. He kept himself so aloof. He was a sort of godlike godlike figure. So a single word from him um, would travel around the world as a great scoop. Ralph Parker, of course, um, was given had some of his questions answered, and one of them was when it became clear that Stalin had very different ideas on the future of Poland from Churchill. Of course, Churchill had gone to war to defend the independence of Poland. Um, um, uh, Ralph Parker popped some questions in and saying, "Do you believe in a strong and independent Poland?" Question mark. Answer: indubitably. Next question. Now, what did that mean? A single question. But the fact that he'd said that had a huge effect. Those people in London who were anxious, who suspected that basically Stalin was going to roll over the British, didn't give a damn what Churchill thought, was just going to take over Poland. The fact that he had said indubitably he was in favor of a strong and independent Poland without any details or any context at all, that sort of gave them something to, gave them a straw to hang on to, really. So the Stalin interviews were an example of extremely successful media management.
What was the Great Terror or Great Purge? When did it happen? And how much did the world know about it at the time?
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, there was in the early 1930s, there were the show trials when all of Stalin's rivals for power, or were one by one, or two by two, or 10 by 10, were put on trial in open court, and the proceedings covered quite lavishly in the papers. They were accused of taking part in ludicrous conspiracies with various foreigners, Poles, British, you name it, Japanese. Uh, they all, one way or another, confessed to these ludicrous accusations, causing people to question what on earth was going on. Obviously, some torture was involved, long time in jail. So that was the beginning. The Great Terror happened in 1937 to 1938. Stalin had just declared a great victory in his crash industrialization of Russia. And he stood up and said, "Fellow countrymen, life is getting easier, life is getting gayer, life will be more jolly." And everyone thought, phew, after all this hard work, we can relax a bit. In fact, the opposite happened. Um, uh, the the security police, which changed its name quite regularly, started off as the OGPU and then became the NKVD, arrested tens of thousands of people, originally in the Communist Party, but but after that, just about anyone who had a foreign name, who seemed to be of Polish origin, even school teachers in villages who someone had denounced. There was an orgy of bloodletting, where tens of thousands were just shot in the back of the head after a non-existent trial, or were sent to hard labor in the parts of the Soviet Union where no one wanted to work, to the Arctic, to Central Asia, to the Far East, to the gold mines there. And if they were lucky, they survived until Stalin died. If not, they just died of overwork, starvation. So those were the two crimes of Stalin that everyone wanted to know, because there had been almost very few journalists. It was a journalistic desert towards the end of the 30s. It was so difficult to work there that the New York Times correspondent, this is the man who followed the notorious Walter Duranty. He was an Englishman called Eric Geddy. In 1941, he said, "As a news center, Moscow has ceased to exist, and every correspondent still there knows that his work is entirely valueless. With that, he closed down the New York Times bureau in 1941 and went to actually do some war work with the British. Of course, he didn't make any friends in the New York Times because within a year, Roosevelt and Stalin were allies, and the New York Times didn't have a bureau any longer, which is why Ralph Parker came into came into the picture, because the New York Times had had a bureau there for I think since the early 20s, which was which was a record unmatched by any other Western paper.
From your knowledge, how many reporters are there, Western reporters, in Moscow or in Russia today during this Ukraine war?
Many fewer than there were. The BBC has a correspondent called Steve Rosenberg who's been there, I think, for 20 years. Um, he's a he is a fluent Russian speaker, uh, a, a pianist of concert quality, can play anything, um, and he watches his words very carefully. Uh, he's very useful. I think the Russians are happy to say that the BBC man is there, but run one wrong word and he could be out. Some of the newspaper special correspondents uh, may report from Latvia, Lithuania, other 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 parts, other nearby parts, but they have to renew their visas every 3 months. Every 3 months, they have to set foot back in Moscow and go through the process of reviewing their visas. Um, they think very after the arrest of Ivan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal correspondent, on spying charges. They are extremely cautious about going back with good reason, for fear that they could either be sentenced to long periods of jail, or could just be held, and this is more likely, or could just be held as pawns to be exchanged with someone that the Russians want, who is being held by the Americans. So some the majority of people dip in and out, and they're careful where they go and what questions they ask, because of course the majority of people do not want to speak to them.
In the early 40s, 41 or so, at the Metropol, how many of the correspondents were men? How many translators were women?
I would say all the translators were women. The men were at the front. Um, at that time, foreign correspondentry was overwhelmingly a a male profession. Um, Among the ones I write about, there was Charlotte Haldane, who was a British communist, a card-carrying member of the party, who persuaded the Daily Sketch newspaper that she was, because of her beliefs, she was best placed to get the interview with Stalin. She went out there. There was Anna Louise Strong, an American communist who was there quite a lot, though she was forced, uh, even she, with her loyal communist views, was arrested at some stage. There was a unique correspondent in the form of Alice Leon Motes. She was a wealthy socialite from a family which was big donors to the Democratic Party, quite close to Roosevelt. And she happened to wind up in Moscow at the start of the war because she knew the American ambassador, she knew everybody, and she said, "Oh well, I'm going to turn myself into a reporter." She managed to get a gig with Collier's magazine, and which resulted in the ambassador spending several months trying to get her to be evacuated, along with what he called the embassy women, i.e., all the women at the American embassy. She refused until eventually, towards 1942, she had to leave. But she was a rare case. So women reporters were infinitesimally small.
As the reporters were sitting there in 1941, what was the war situation and the story behind why Germany and Russia had signed an agreement, non-aggression agreement, and then they ended up, of course, fighting each other? And how important was that to your story?
Um, my story begins um, at the end after Hitler invaded in June 1941. That was when Stalin became an ally of Hitler, sorry, an ally of Churchill, a great Bolshevik basher in his youth, and of course Roosevelt, um, uh, increasingly a member of the alliance and a full member of the alliance after Pearl Harbor. Um, well, in terms of reporting, there were many things you weren't allowed to get to report, many things you couldn't get past the censor, and you certainly could not get a single word about the fact that at the beginning of the Second World War, Stalin was Hitler's non-belligerent ally, providing food and fuel for the invasion of France and the bombing of London. Uh, the reporters were only allowed to report the latest news from the war, which they got usually from the newspapers, and anything beyond that was just scrubbed out with a red pencil or a blue pencil. Of course, if you could get a Soviet official to talk about it, they would say, "Well, we had no choice um, but to um, uh, but we had no choice uh, at that time because we'd been let down by Britain and France. Of course, Britain and France had allowed Hitler and indeed encouraged Hitler to take over Czechoslovakia, um, much to the despair of the Czechs. So they would say, well, throughout the 30s, Soviet Union had proposed some sort of a European security arrangement, which would involve the Russians and everyone against Hitler. But the French and the British turned us down. They betrayed us. So what could we do? We had to save ourselves. We knew we were going to be invaded at some stage, and we needed time to build our armaments up to scratch. That's what they'd say. But you wouldn't have seen a word about that in any of the reports of the correspondence there.
So, what was the life of a correspondent like, and what was the relationship with the translator?
Well, I'll quote Edgar Snow. He was one of the best known journalists at the time. He was a man who was used to finding his own news, not being told what to write or getting it out of newspapers. He famously trudged in China, trudged to the interior of the country and tracked down Mao Zedong, who was the communist guerrilla leader, but really an unknown figure to the Western world until he interviewed him and indeed wrote a book called Red Star Over China, which was very influential and indeed a bestseller. So when he arrived, he was shocked at the passivity of the journalists who seemed to accept that they were billeted in relative luxury by the standards of wartime and not doing particularly much. This is what he wrote in his diary. Many correspondents do not leave the hotel for weeks in winter, but rely on secretaries and newspapers. The translators were known as secretaries. The secretary orders breakfast in the morning, arranges pillow under your head while you eat it, shops for cigarettes and vodka, translates, interprets, teaches you Russian, and sometimes goes to bed with you. In exchange, the correspondent brings back tidbits from the dining room: bread, cake, cheese, and meat. It's a daily event to see correspondents trooping up to their rooms with a plateful of bread and cheese. This makes it sound as if the translators were greedy. In fact, they took this food home to feed their families because uh, if you weren't working uh, uh, the most important sort of arms factories or doing most of war work, you were practically starving. You had 400 grams, a few slices of black bread, and some other um, some other tea and things from time to time. So the crumbs from the journalist's table meant a lot. Um, uh, so that was at the beginning. So Snow was very shocked at their passivity. Um, as he began to understand the system, he realized that the only way that a journalist could find out about Russia or could even be introduced to people outside the foreign ministry was through their correspondence. Sorry, through their translators. So they exerted huge influence, some in favor of the Kremlin, and some, of course, more interestingly, and this is really the most important point of the book, some were secret dissidents who, under the eyes and within the under the eyes of the security services, the KGB of the time, whispered what was really going on in Russia, what was life was really like um, in wartime, and what had really been happening in the Great Terror and during the purges. Of course, these women put themselves in huge danger, and after the war, some of them ended up in the Gulag, not surprisingly.
Who was Nadia?
Nadia, she's the heroine of the book. She was a Jewish girl born in a shtetl, a rather small one, which is in modern day Ukraine. Um, Her grandfather was a rabbi, and she followed the precepts of Judaism until he died. And then in 1917, when the two revolutions took place, the family moved to Odessa, much in the news these days during Putin's attack on Ukraine, which was the most cosmopolitan place in Ukraine, and I think probably the third biggest city in the Russian Empire, as it was. So a vibrant place, completely different from life in a muddy shtetl where not much happened at all. Anyway, she was a precocious girl, and she immediately latched on to revolutionary socialism, and she ended up fighting with a man who would become her husband in the Civil War on the side of the Reds, the Bolsheviks. After that, she and her husband worked for Soviet military intelligence. They went to Germany, they went to Shanghai, and most importantly, they spent a couple of years in New York, where their job was to steal military technological secrets in the 30s. The Soviet Union was spending a huge amount of money buying technology, learning about automation and industrialization. But Nadia's job was to get the secrets that the Americans didn't want to sell. So, with the help of members of the American Communist Party, she would hang around uh, naval bases, arms factories, and to get plans and information from communist sympathetic workers. And that's what she did for 2 years before returning to Moscow. As a result of her good English and indeed her American accented English, she was an obvious choice to go and work in the Metropol as a translator for the English speaking reporters. which she had to do some sort of war work, and she accepted to do it.
What happened to her?
Um, when she came back from New York, she had understood that the propaganda she'd heard about the starving masses in New York was very exaggerated, and that you could, if you worked in the Ford car plant, um, you could have a reasonable life. You weren't that oppressed. Um, when she came back, she found that the Great Terror was happening, was in full force, and some of her friends were dragged away, beaten half to death, and then shot. So she and her husband completely lost all faith in Stalin, but they couldn't mention it to anybody. Um, they sort of kept quiet about it. So she found herself in a contradictory position in the hotel. She was supposed to be guiding the journalists in the right course, um, uh, so that only the best of the Soviet Union um, would be revealed. While Hitler was on the edges of the gates of Moscow, she suppressed these thoughts. But when it became clear that Stalin was winning, she opened up, and she was looking for reporters she could trust. Um, she was enough of a revolutionary to distrust the British. She saw them as snobs, and she particularly distrusted British correspondents who, while coming from the upper classes or the bourgeoisie, pretended to be on the side of the workers. She hated that. Um, um, she was reluctant to open up too much to Americans. She thought they were careerists, and whatever she said would end up in the pages of the New York Times one way or another. But she did trust an Australian uh, who said, we're not snobs like the English. We always support the underdog. Anyway, um, she translated him for a while and basically got him to Stalingrad after the battle, which, as an Australian, he wouldn't normally have done. So she did some good work for him, and uh, they used to spend a lot of time talking in her room. And her husband was there also because he'd been wounded, and he would explain what happened in the Civil War. So he wrote in a tiny little notebook, a series of notebooks in script he thought was too small for anyone to read, everything that she and her husband had told him. And before he left, he said, Nadia, there's one more thing I want. She said, what's that? She said, I've never been to see how a Soviet family lives. This was completely impossible at that time. Um, you were not allowed to go to any reporters were not allowed to go to anyone's home unless it was some film star or something like that. Um, he said, I want to see how ordinary people live. And Nadia said, okay, well, and she arranged that they met outside the hotel one evening in the dark and went on the metro. And after making sure they weren't followed, they went up to an apartment. It wasn't an apartment; it was one room where two old ladies lived. Both had lost their husbands, had been shot for their bourgeois origins. They lived on a pittance, one making hats to sell in the market, one making buttons and dolls. So they basically had nothing and didn't expect anything. Um, uh, the correspondent, he was called Godfrey Blunden, was very moved by this. In fact, he was almost sort of speechless when he left. And on the way back to the hotel in the dark, Nadia said, you can't write this. You could cause a lot of trouble if you wrote this. And he said, don't worry, I'll put it in a novel. Well, eventually the novel did appear. It was called A Room on the Route, as in road, Route, a room on the route, because the room that these ladies lived in happened to overlook the road where Stalin and his motorcade would pass regularly between the Kremlin and his dacha. So um, I, it was written as a thriller, but it was a sort of download from his notebooks. Um, the room where the two ladies lived was easily identifiable from the book. Um, Both ladies were arrested. One of them was forced to reveal all. Um, Nadia was arrested. Obviously, she was known as the translator. She spent 3 years in pre-trial detention in the Lubyanka, just up the road from the Metropol, and was given 15 years in the Gulag and sent to Vorkuta, an Arctic mining settlement in the far north, uh, and various other places. And she was in various labor camps until Stalin died, when um, the new regime decided to empty the Gulag as quickly as possible of the political detainees. So she survived. Her daughter got 25 years, even longer. She survived too. And afterwards, Nadia settled as a dissident. Really, she would she translated Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, which is a very influential book uh, about a middle-ranking Communist Party cadre, um, which was very influential. And certainly, when her husband read it, he said, "Ah, now this has been translated into Russian. I feel our work is done." He died, but Nadia and her daughter in the 70s were allowed to emigrate to Israel, which is where she spent the rest of her life.
If you were
You
sitting
did?
in the Metropol Hotel in 1941, how much, by that time, how many people had Stalin ordered killed?
Um,
If you total up the Great Terror and the
oh,
famine
the famine.
and the war.
We must be well. Well, in the war, of course, the executions continued, the deportations continued. Uh, Stalin received so many Studebaker trucks from America that he had enough to spare to deport the nationalities that he didn't like the Chechens and the Ingush from the North Caucasus, and dump them in the wastes of Kazakhstan, where they either survived or not. I mean, I mean, we could be talking about 5 million people dying, and uh, hundreds of thousands having to spend years in the Gulag.
How how many of those reporters were even aware of this? Or, for that matter, how many, I know you're British, but how many Americans or Brits would know how ruthless he was?
Well, that's a very good question. I think my answer is to go to go is to recount the press trip organized to the mass graveyard at Katyn, where where the bodies of thousands of Polish officers were buried and had been discovered by the invading Germans. Um, uh, when these bodies were discovered, Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, made a big hullabaloo about it. And the Russians, of course, said, "No, no, it's this is all wrong. This is all wrong. It was the Germans that killed them." I don't think anyone believed them. Anyway, this was a very sensitive issue in wartime, because obviously Churchill had gone to war for the sake of Poland, and Stalin looked like he was keen to Bolshevize Poland, um, uh, at the cost of um, driving into exile or killing the elites in the army, the professions, and in business. Anyway, eventually the Red Army drove the Germans away back, and took control of the grave site. They spent about 6 months uh, falsifying various documents found on the on the dead Polish officers to indicate that they had actually been alive in 1941 when the Germans came. In fact, they had been killed in 1940. Anyway, so the journalists were taken there, and the Russians had set up an outdoor forensic laboratory in tents. And this was February, it was very cold, and they were taken there, and they could see autopsies being conducted of these bodies, which had been killed 3 or 4 years before. And one remembers very closely the chief surgeon of the army pulling out a stinking liver and holding it up to the journalists and saying, look how fresh it is, look how fresh it is. Must be from 1941. Anyway, so they were told that it was the Germans that did it. They weren't sure what to believe, and when journalists are on a press trip, they sort of get together and scratch their chins and their beards and think about it. And the journalist who'd been there longest was a Russian-born American called Alexander Vert, whose book Russia at War, 1941 to 45, is worth reading, even though his pro-Stalin bias is very clear. And he told them, and he was regarded as the expert, he told them that the Soviet security forces never shot anyone in the back of the head. That was what the Germans did. He also said that victims may have died in the camps from starvation or overwork, but it was never, they were never shot in cold blood, which was obviously completely untrue. And Alexander Vert wanted to believe this. I'm sure that the whole of Poland knew exactly what the Soviet security forces did. I'm sure that it was not hard to find out that shooting in the back of the head was indeed the way of doing it. The New York Times correspondent had only just arrived, so he wasn't very knowledgeable. So the journalists sort of followed the line given them by Alexander Vert and just said, well, this is what we were told, and any lines which cast doubt on the Soviet disinformation they'd been given were excised from their reports by the censor. So they didn't know very much. The secrecy which had surrounded what happened in the Great Terror was enough for the reporters, when guided by some fellow travelers, not to know very much. That's the shocking thing, I think. They could have known much more.
In your research, in order to be able to write this book, what was the most valuable place to go or material that was available?
The most valuable was discovering the recorded memoirs of Nadia. She didn't write a book. I don't quite know why. Her life story is worth a couple of books, really. But her daughter did sit her down before she died and record what she said. She has a very good memory, and particularly of people. So we got hold of the Russian text of that. That was a brilliant source. The British archives of the Foreign Office, of how they dealt with the journalists, how basically they decided that it was necessary for the alliance for the journalists to be allowed to be manipulated, and then they got very cold feet towards the end and realized that the journalists were never going to reveal that they'd been manipulated, and that probably any permanent correspondent based in Moscow of a newspaper was going to be forced to become, willingly or not, a Kremlin mouthpiece.
At the end of your book, you say this, that Stalin won the propaganda war and was able to suppress all negative coverage of the Soviet Union, in part thanks to the complicity of the press, is not in doubt.
Yes. Yes, I would say that. I would add, of course, that I don't think Roosevelt was particularly keen to see negative coverage of his ally Stalin. Roosevelt certainly believed that he could charm Stalin, and and Churchill too, even though of course he had been a very effective foreign correspondent in his youth, and he always called himself an old journalist, not a former journalist, an old journalist. He put aside his knowledge or his understanding of how the trade should work in the interests of the alliance. But I always wonder what they feared would happen. Did they think that Stalin would stop fighting Hitler? No, Stalin was always going to fight Hitler because he had to drive Hitler from Soviet land. There was a lot of, not only the journalists but also the politicians were tiptoeing around Stalin's sensitivities all the time, and Stalin knew exactly what was going on. He was happy to manipulate and to expose the differences between Roosevelt and Churchill, for example.
You got to wrap it up, but I need to ask you, have you ever stayed in the Metropol Hotel?
I have stayed in the Metropol Hotel. It's a fine place. There's always someone playing the harp when you come down for breakfast. When you know the history and you walk the extraordinarily wide corridors of the hotel in the upper floors, you can sort of feel that Stalin and Trotsky would have been walking along there, planning how one was going to overthrow the other, basically.
The name of the book is The Red Hotel. Our guest is Alan Philps. And the subtitle is Moscow 1941, The Metropol Hotel, and the Untold Story of Stalin's Propaganda War. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.